topic of this lecture originally was to be the new Cold War and what the distinguishing features are of the Cold War since 1991 when the Soviet Union dissolved. But the Cold War is really an exercise in American empire. And I think that if you're looking at the dynamics of the American empire, they're very similar to empires throughout the ages. And one of the leading characteristics is that empires don't pay. They obviously don't pay when they destroy their enemies, but they also bleed their allies. And in the end, they impoverish their home population as well. The population at home suffers. So the guiding dynamic of empires is asset stripping, first their opponents, then their allies, and then their domestic population. And that's their common aim of an empire. The first objective, obviously, is to conquer foreign lands and seize their wealth and their money. But that involves creating alliances and arm-twisting allies to make them bear the cost of the imperial war making, always called defense. Like America is insisting that its allies share the costs of NATO and back it when it attacked the Near East, Iraq, Libya, and other countries. But it not only does the imperial power exploit the allies for military defense, it insists that they subsidize the imperial nation's domestic affluence and public spending programs. So the resulting internal strain develops. It becomes a war on two fronts. You're pressuring allies as well as your enemies until it's really unclear who's being most exploited. I think preventing other countries from keeping the fruits of their labor and land and resources in their own economies and preventing them from raising their own living standards requires political meddling and political interference. Because obviously, if other countries are democratic and have their own freedom, they're going to want to keep their own prosperity at home. So any empire has to rule through client oligarchies. It has to back rulers in these countries that represent really the imperial power's interests, the US interests, not that of their own countries. So the alliance becomes more and more coercive, and it drives foreign countries to withdraw from the imperial system. And once you withdraw, you become an enemy, because either you're in the empire or you're out. As George Bush said, either you're with us or against us. And since the end of World War II, US diplomacy has created a tributary system that transfers wealth and affluence from other countries to itself. It has become faddish to characterize this as a Thucydides problem, as if America is jealous of China somehow, and as if it's inevitable that there's a war between a rising power and an established power. And the established power usually makes war on the rival, but the Americans who developed the idea of Thucydides' problem did it really to trivialize what the conflict between China, Russia, and other countries outside of the US sphere is all about. It's a false analogy that trivializes the US opposition to China, Russia, Iran, Venezuela, and other countries that resist the American takeover of their natural resources and their drive to privatize their infrastructure, just as if, well, we're a little jealous and we want to control them. But that's what really is at issue is a conflict of political systems. And the conflict is over whether countries should be privatized and private rent-seeking will be made tax-free and relying on US banks and the US Treasury to create essentially foreign reserves, or whether countries are going to be independent. And demanding tribute, demanding that American firms have to invest and own the leading sectors of foreign countries, their raw materials, their land, their technology, is not really rivalry, and it's not jealousy. It's not that America is jealous of countries it wants to exploit. It wants to subjugate them. It just wants to take them over. So in today's world, the way that you achieve subjugation of opponents is more financial than military. They don't do it by an army, they do it by financial takeover. The Soviet Union did not understand this in 1991 when it let the United States advisors create its neoliberal shock therapy. That was voucher privatization giveaways, kleptocracy, appropriating and selling Soviet resources to American investors and financiers. I don't think the Russian and post-Soviet victims understood how their economies were being defeated by being privatized and financialized and made dependent on dollar diplomacy. The appropriate analogy, if you're going to talk about the Thucydides problem, the appropriate analogy with ancient Greece is the war between Athens and Sparta in the fifth century. And it was an existential conflict between oligarchy and democracy. It wasn't a rivalry between politically similar city-states. They were quite different. Sparta was the leading protector subsidizing Greek oligarchies. It had turned its neighboring Messenia population into serf-like helots. They were forced to produce a crop surplus to feed a militarized, non-commercial, and even non-monetized citizenry in Sparta. What Sparta opposed wasn't Athenian prosperity, so it wasn't jealous of prosperity, it shunned it. It very carefully avoided any show of prosperity within Sparta itself. What it opposed in Athens was democratic reform. It feared that this might be contagious and that democracy might spread, and there goes the Spartan oligarchy. Now, under Solon in Athens in 594 BC, Athens had been one of the last Greek city-states to end debt slavery. Soon thereafter, Pisistratus and his sons developed the Athenian public sector, public spending to employ Athenians, and the economy was further democratized in the 5th century under Pericles and Ephialtes. Athens backed other democracies through what it called the Delian League, based on the sacred island of Delos. Just as in modern times, people will have the United Nations offices in Switzerland or in somewhere in Geneva, somewhere not in the empire's core. Athens had organized its alliance through the Delian League. But the system became exploitative. As Athenian demands for support in military support and the cost of building its ships to oppose Sparta, allied city-states had to pay the costs. And Athens is doing what the United States does when it taps its allies for military support in NATO and the coalition of the willing to take over Iraq and fight other countries or boycott their exports that are targeted by US officials. So the Thucydides problem and the clash of civilization theory both neglect the strains that were caused by Athenian attempts to create an empire to rival Sparta's oligarchic alliances. Thucydides, who was a general for Athens and also wrote the history of the Peloponnesian War that we all had to read in college, wrote, "The whole Hellenic world," that is the Greek world, "was convulsed as struggles being everywhere made by particular chiefs being in the Athenian Democracy League or the Sparta's Achaean League. Macedonia and Delphi were part of the Spartan-Persian alliance, and they were opposed by the Delian League, and the treasurers of the Delian League were all Athenians, and they financed as much as 2/3 of Athens' public budget just from its allies by the annual tribute of about 400 talents originally. That's a large amount of silver. Now, this tribute from its allies enabled Athens to avoid imposing new taxes on its own citizens. The money was paid in the form of Athenian owls. Athenian silver coins had an owl on them. That was the symbol of Athens. And they were the dollars of their day. They were the most typical silver coinage. And the they were minted at Athens' own mines. Right near Athens, there was a mineral area called laurium, and that produced the silver that Athens could make its own coinage from. So it didn't have to earn foreign exchange to pay mercenaries and to build ships and to pay its population. It was able to create its own money. And in that sense, also, Athens was like the United States, which simply prints its own money and creates its own money. It doesn't have to earn it abroad. Now, the Parthenon in Athens, up on the hill, the great Athenian public architecture, was built largely with Delegate League tribute from 447 to 432 BC. And by about 425 BC, Athens had tripled the Delegate League's annual tribute to over 1,200 talents. That is, you can think of it as a ton of silver a year. And this continued until finally Athens was defeated by Sparta in 404 BC, which is when the Peloponnesian War ended. So in the face of this Athenian democratic imperialism, is what it was called, because Athens was democratic, but was also imperialist towards its allies, less prosperous cities were unable to avoid a debt crisis. And some cities, like Corcyra, were going into debt crisis. And I'm going to quote what Thucydides wrote about Corcyra in 427 BC. He said, during the 7 days that an Athenian general backed the democratic faction against the oligarchs, stayed with 60 ships, the Corcyraeans were engaged in butchering those of their fellow citizens whom they regarded as their enemies, namely the oligarchs. And although the crime imputed was that of attempting to put down democracy, some were also slain for private hatred, others by their debtors because of the monies owed to them. And in the next century, throughout all of Greece, there was a constant war between debtors and creditors. The creditors won, assassinated or killed the pro-debtor advocates, and Greece ended up an oligarchy. Now, much of the US diplomacy that propped up General Pinochet in Chile and similar terrorist regimes and dictatorships throughout Latin America, Sparta installed the notorious 30 tyrants in Athens after its victory in 404. Already in 411, Athens' own oligarchs had sort of taken over and appointed a consul that said, we don't want to have to pay our taxes to support social programs. We don't want to spend on the democracy. We want to keep all the money for ourselves. Well, they were overthrown, but then Sparta put in an utterly corrupt regime, which is what oligarchic empires do. You put in client oligarchies. So what happened, the defeat of Athens in 404 BC saw what had been a democracy evolve into an oligarchy. And as much as what happened in the United States after the Vietnam War. And in addition to being oligarchic, the United States is like Sparta in backing client oligarchies abroad. There also are economic parallels. Sparta lived by military subjugation of the Helot population that I described. America's pre-Civil War South was also a belligerent, slave-owning plantation economy. And while Sparta relied on neighboring Perioki towns to produce its handicraft, America's South relied on England for its industry. The South fought against the North and wanted to prevent northern cities from becoming industrial centers, because they said, if you have more population in the North, they're going to bid up the price of grain to feed our slaves, and we'll have to pay more to the slaves, raise the price of cotton, and we won't be able to get the monopoly of plantation exports that we have to England. So they were pushing to prevent American industrialization, which is largely what the Civil War was about, whether America would be industrial or a slave-owning South. But also the United States, since the 1980s, has deindustrialized and is turning to China to produce its industrial products. And in this sense, the United States has many things in common with Sparta during the Peloponnesian War. But it's also like Athens in organizing an alliance of democratic imperialism to fund its military operations. It's basically Athens used its monetary power to build up the trireme ships, hire military mercenaries, and pay its own soldiers. Well, America essentially fights its war with foreign mercenaries like ISIS, or which is essentially its foreign legion, and various terrorist groups, and the people that it hires in its color revolutions to try to overthrow its enemies from within. So if you look back at the Greek struggle between militarized Sparta and the more commercialized Athenian economy, neither the Spartan South nor the Athenian North provide a positive model. We're not dealing with a simple conflict between good and evil. But today, we can see that the United States is sponsoring the worst of both worlds. It has a militarized subjugation of other countries, ruling through client oligarchies and NATO and other alliances, through dollar diplomacy, and it forces its allies to pay the cost of its military conquest and by the dollar standard. And essentially, its financial imperialism is what is creating American affluence. Well, obviously, the Greek conflict didn't end with the Peloponnesian War. Sparta's victory led to an influx of silver, and all of that was taken by the landowning families and the elite, and they used it to buy out the lands of smaller holders. By the 3rd century, almost all the lands had been so concentrated that Sparta's kings, it was always ruled by 2 kings, decided, well, the only way we can rebuild Sparta's military might, now that we've disenfranchised all the landowners, is to cancel all the debts and redistribute the land. In other words, they became radical. So the neighboring oligarchies said, they called in Rome to sort of help them destroy Sparta, and there was a long fight. Rome did destroy Sparta, and then it conquered and devastated all of Athens and Greece. It stripped all of the wealth from the temples, burned down the cities, and it ended Greece's political independence. And from about 200 BC on, the history of the ancient world is that of Rome. And many people, as I'm sure you've heard, compare the US empire to the Roman Empire, and the decline and fall of Rome to the decline and fall of the United States. And it's interesting, if you look at today's Cold War, you can see a lot of parallels there. There's a kind of vocabulary of invective that was used in antiquity that's much like today. Rome, the oligarchies in Rome accused any reformer who wanted to cancel the debts and advocate democracy of seeking kingship. In other words, kingship to Rome was having a government strong enough to control the wealthy classes and control the wealth and make it used for the public instead of for the very few. The Americans call any reformer or nationalist or wants to be independent a communist. So the Americans called Vietnam communist or socialist in the 1960s, when Vietnam was fighting basically a nationalist war. It called Castro communist, and ultimately drove Castro into the Russian camp by saying that anyone who is against American rights to take over their banks, to take over their industry, is a communist. This has been elaborated by Samuel Huntington and the American elite into what they call a clash of civilization. And in practice, it's a clash of civilization against socialist countries, that they say, that are trying to defend their economies from foreign exploitation. The civilization is America's financialized democratic imperialism. The civilization it's clashing is America's support of military dictatorships, of terrorist dictatorships throughout Latin America, Pinochet in Chile, the recent dictatorships in Honduras and other countries, and throughout the world. And this American civilization is fighting against countries trying to be independent, as if it's a completely different civilization for other countries to want to be independent and to want to be democratic. So the fight of civilization is a fight of America's military oligarchy against other countries seeking to elect their own presidents and keep their wealth in their own hands instead of paying tribute to the United States through finance capitalism and the dollar standard that we'll be discussing in the next lecture. Now, the Roman historian Tacitus quoted the words of a Scottish opponent of Rome, Calgulus, in 87 AD. Tacitus said, if their enemy has wealth, they have greed. Meaning the Romans have greed. If the enemy is poor, then the Americans are ambitious. To plunder, butcher, steal, these things the Romans misname empire. They make a desolation and they call it peace. Sometimes it's translated, they make a desert and they call it peace. The US orchestrated takeover of Russia under Yeltsin in the 1990s. And the ruin of Greece and Argentina in the 2010s are typical examples of empires that are engaged in asset stripping. And that's what empires do. They strip the assets of other countries. Now, depicting the coalition of the willing as the free world, the United States embeds its policy of world domination in a kind of universalist rhetoric, sounding vehicles like the International Monetary Fund. It's really the American Monetary Fund or the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It really is telling other country, Asia, do what America tells you to do. There's always a nice euphemism for this. The idea is to tap the Allies and finance the military costs of extending the American empire, much like Athens did. But Rome forms the basic prototype for financial looting backed by military hegemony. Rome claimed to bring order to its empire, but by bringing order, it meant we're just going to sack your temples, steal everything in your palaces, grab the land and impoverish your population. That's what bringing order is. And today we call that the free market. We call that free enterprise, leading to the concentration of wealth. And in Rome, there was a phrase where there were public debt collectors, the publicani, they were called, public officials of Rome. Disorder reigned. The publicani were called knights. A knight meaning equestrian cavalry. You had to have enough money to qualify as being almost as rich as a senator. So the financial class in Rome became its administrative class because Rome said, we hate enterprise. We think it's vulgar to actually make things. That's what the working class does. That's what the people we exploit do. We'll make them do the handicrafts and we'll make slaves make our furniture industry. And what we will do is just charge rent and have our slaves make money for us by usury, and we'll lend money to foreign countries that we conquer them, we make them pay tribute, and then we lend them the money to pay the tribute. And Brutus, for instance, the Brutus who stabbed Caesar, and Caesar said, "A2 Brutus," he charged Cilicia 42% interest, annual interest. And wanted to use the cavalry to act as his debt collectors when Cicero was the governor of Cilicia. So we're dealing with a very rapacious financial class that acted as the enforcers of the empire. And so one of the modern historians of the publicans, Ernst Badian of Harvard, wrote, where there was a publicanus, there was no effective public law and no freedom for the subjects. That's what Livy, the Roman historian, wrote in the 2nd century BC. And Barker's Abadian is simply quoting him. So what's so ironic is something that happened after 133 BC in Rome. The two reformers, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, ended up being murdered, had said, the Senate is so corrupt, we've got to have someone who will man the courts and overcome the corruption of the Senate. And let's have the publicans, the financial class, act as the jury class, and he puts them in charge of the juries, thinking that they would somehow be more fair. And the hope always has been that financial managers may work honestly and benefit the public. And that assumption has always been fallacious. In practice, the publicans and their fellow creditors enrich themselves by lending Roman provinces the money to pay the taxes and then charging enormous interest rates and strip and grabbing tax-exempt property of the temples, private property, grabbing whatever they could, including artworks that people would have, and especially grabbing attractive women who the daughters of the rulers of the Roman administrators wanted. I mean, that's the whole history of Rome, is filled with melodramatic stories of such abuses that are about as bad as the abuses that you find the Americans doing in Abu Ghraib and other places today. So the moral of looking at history is that the financial class historically has used its power against society at large. And it uses empires, not only against enemies, but against allies and against the domestic population. And in the end, Rome's domestic debt burden led to constant civil warfare, 5 centuries of civil warfare urging a debt cancellation and land redistribution. And in the end, Pliny, the Roman historian and naturalist, said that latifundia, the large landed estates, are the ruin of Rome. And Rome collapsed into feudalism and brought in a dark age. And that is what happens when you have a world empire, or at least an empire large enough to absorb most of the world. It brings on a dark age. And that's what makes today's fight, the clash of civilization between the American empire and other countries, so important. So now I'll focus entirely on what the United States created as an imperial system after World War II. In the closing years, in 1944 and 45, the first thing the Americans wanted to do to create a post-war world was to break up the British Empire. And you did this by making a loan to Britain that was broke from the war. Many of its men had died, and there were many more women than men, which helped make it more socialist at the time. And Britain desperately needed a loan. So the Americans said, okay, we'll lend you the money so that you won't starve, but you have to make there's some conditions for it. You're going to break up your sterling area. You can't have, that's protectionist. We want free trade, meaning we want access to your sterling area. We want India and Australia, Canada and other countries in the sterling area to be able to buy American goods and to let American companies come in. Essentially, America wanted to replace Britain, the same as it wanted to replace France. So Britain had to not use its sterling area balances to buy its goods. The sterling area ended up as a arm of the American empire. Now, also, the United States created 2 post-war vehicles that have done everything they can to destroy the world economy and which must be ended for other countries to progress. And these 2 vehicles are the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And they were created to open up trade and financial markets, to essentially let US investors buy control of foreign natural resources and industry, and to lock in foreign dependency on the United States. The World Bank makes loans to governments to create export infrastructure, to buy US and European technology, build dams, build roads, and not to be self-sufficient in their own food. They're supposed to shift the World Bank finances, Latin America, Africa, and Near Eastern agriculture to produce export crops that do not compete with American grain exports. So the idea is to make other countries dovetail into the American economy by being dependent on the US economy. Well, the result of following the World Bank advice is to run a deepening trade deficit and a balance of payments deficit. And then the International Monetary Fund comes in and said, well, we'll lend you the money so your currency doesn't collapse, but you have to agree to do certain things. We want a free market. A free market means you prevent labor unions. You have to either jail or preferably kill all the labor union leaders. You have to lower the minimum wage. You have to devalue currency, and we'll protect the rich people because just before you collapse, we'll lend enough money for you to support the currency so all of your wealthy oligarchs can move their money out of Brazil or out of Argentina at a high exchange rate. Then we'll let it all collapse. And once they've got their money into dollars, we'll let the currency collapse. And what that really does is devalue the price of labor. So the IMF plan for stability is to lower the price of labor steadily and steadily and steadily. And the final arm of this is the US Agency for International Development, meaning the Agency for International Backwardness. And its job is to finance assassination programs and terrorism throughout the world. And I'm going to go through this later. And then finally, America creates military alliances like NATO and SEATO, the Near Eastern, with Turkey and Near Eastern countries, to co-opt them into reliance on America's military exports. So in the heads of the World Bank, the most noteworthy heads have all been military leaders. The most noteworthy were Assistant Secretary of War John McCloy, the first major president of the World Bank, 1947 to 49. I'm sure you all know John McNamara, the Secretary of Defense. He was the World Bank president during 1968 to 81. And then the most bellicose World Bank president is Deputy Secretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz in 2005 to 2007. Now, already in April of 1992, when he was Undersecretary of Defense under George H.W. Bush, the older Bush, Wolfowitz and Louis Scooter Libby presented a memorandum to the Defense Planning Committee for 1990, how America was going to organize the world militarily, 1994 to 99. And he asserted, quote, "We must maintain the mechanism for deterring potential competitors from even aspiring to a larger regional or global role." This was a declaration of war. US officials demanded total command and announcing that they felt threatened if they could not control the politics and domestic economic policy of other countries. They felt threatened that these countries might keep their wealth at home and that the American economy would collapse. So they said, we have to control them. Our wealth depends upon keeping other countries poor. That's all written in to the official American foreign policy. And the major lever of imposing this conquest is financial. The IMF, as I said, it finances client oligarchies. The IMF will lend money to political allies such as Ukraine, even when the money's stolen by Ukrainian oligarchs, but it will withhold credit from countries that America wants to overthrow. So America can use the International Monetary Fund to essentially, Wall Street can do a currency raid on an unfriendly country, meaning a country wanting to be independent, and the IMF will then bail it out once it turns pro-American, and the IMF will say, you see, that's the free market. You'll get rich when you support America, or at least, but you'll get, if you don't get rich, at least you'll get poor and to be devastated if you don't have an American proxy government in place. The idea is not really to create competition in a market, it's to prevent competition. Countries are told to sell off their public enterprises in order to raise the money to pay the money they owe the IMF. And so the World Bank and the IMF and US foreign aid are all used to make foreign countries follow policies that are deemed to be in the US interest. So basically to finance their trade deficits and remit profits to the US, governments go further and further into debt to the IMF to subsidize their deficits that come from financial looting of their economies by the American dollar standard. So in the language of international diplomacy, the word democracy has become disconnected from what it used to mean politically. It used to mean rule by the people, the demos. But now the democracy means a pro-American country. Democracy means mainly you're a military dictatorship like Pinochet in Chile, or a corrupt coup d'etat leader, as in Brazil. Democracy means essentially pro-American oligarchy. And if a country tries to be democratic, it's called communist. Sometimes only socialist, but any country wanting democracy today is accused of being communist, socialist, or Marxist. That's a pretty good compliment for Marxism and socialism. Under Roosevelt, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, America was still anti-colonialist because it wanted to break up the British Empire. But things changed in 1963 when Eisenhower became president, Republican, and brought in probably the two most evil characters in 20th century American history, the Dulles brothers. John Foster Dulles is Secretary of State, and Allen Dulles is head of the CIA. And their program was, if someone wants to be socialist, if someone does not want to let American companies buy them out, they must be assassinated. The Dulles' principle is you cannot negotiate with someone who wants to be independent. You must not only kill them, but overthrow the regime and declare their country an enemy. Now, the first major intervention to block foreign self-determination occurred in Iran. Mohammad Mossadegh had been elected prime minister in 1951 on a program of promising land reform and a land tax and to gain control of Iran's natural oil resources from Anglo-Persian oil. It's now called British Petroleum. The Iranian parliament voted to nationalize the company because it was paying less than 20% of its profits in taxes, and the profits were kept low by clever accounting. In America, we call that Hollywood accounting, that made it appear as if they weren't earning anything on this oil. And the company had promised to build hospitals and schools and raise wages, and it broke all of its commitments that it had promised, so it defaulted on the contract. Now, Winston Churchill and Clement Attlee, who in Britain, with British Petroleum, asked Truman to overthrow Mossadegh. And Truman and his department said, no, nationalists are a bulwark against communism and against the Communist Tudeh party in Iran. But when Eisenhower came in, they said, no, nationalism and self-determination is communism. They're the same. If they're nationalists, they're against this, just as communists are against this. And anyone who's not pro-American is, by definition, a communist. So they arranged with Britain's MI6 to organize a coup d'etat, led by Kermit Roosevelt, to impose the Shah as a dictator on Iran. And we all know what happened The Shah imposed a vicious dictatorship for many decades. Mossadegh, the prime minister, was imprisoned in his own house. They wouldn't let him leave. And when he eventually died, he was buried in his own house just to prevent a public demonstration saying, we want to restore democracy. America said, you cannot have democracy abroad. Democracy is communism and Marxism. Control of oil has always been a key element of US foreign policy because it's so enormously profitable. It's the main source of natural resource rent. And it's basically tax exempt. And so countries that have oil are almost always attacked. It's called the curse of oil. You're attacked by America or England or France, and they grab the oil and they kill your political leaders and they put in their own puppets. And that's essentially what America's done, what America is trying to do right now in Venezuela. It's the alternative is to essentially to let oil be kept in the country itself, and instead of turning the oil profits into the US economy. Now, I could get, there are many technical aspects of and legalistic aspects of oil in the American empire that really have to be looked at as a separate sector. Oil companies in America organize their oil wells and their production facilities in the Near East and elsewhere as branches, not as affiliates. It's not like they own a company that produces oil and pays taxes in these countries. The oil branch or a mining branch, its operations are consolidated into the parent company's balance sheet. So America or Shell Oil or Exxon will get a depletion allowance for depleting foreign companies' oil. They don't have to pay any tax. And as it happened in 1995, the Vietnam War was creating very heavy balance of payments drain on the United States, threatening the dollar's exchange rate. And so President Johnson, who had just replaced Kennedy, passed foreign investment control, voluntary investment controls. Voluntary means do it or we'll throw you in jail. And Johnson passed a rule saying that no country can increase its foreign investment by more than 5% over what it had the previous year. Well, that got the oil industry very upset. And they said, wait a minute, we're making so much money. We're the main support of the American balance of payments. So the oil industry for a century had been dominated by John D. Rockefeller and his successors, and David Rockefeller, his grandson, was head of the Chase Manhattan Bank. So the oil industry went to David Rockefeller and said, can you have calculate just how much money we're getting from abroad on our oil so that we can get exempt from all of the rules. So as it happened, I was the balance of payments economist for Chase Manhattan at that time. And David Rockefeller told me, well, we don't want our oil department to write the report because they think that, after all, they're the lobbyists for the oil company, but nobody knows about you. You're independent. We want you just to talk to all the oil companies. They've agreed to give you all of their internal documentation, and you can look at it all and you come up with the report. If we think they're making a bonanza, but we don't know. Can you spend a year doing the research and finding out what's happening? So I began my research, and I went to Standard Oil of New Jersey, which was the big Rockefeller company, and I was looking through all the statistics. First of all, I began with the public balance of payment statistics, the Department of Commerce statistics, and I couldn't find any profits at all. I looked for oil profits from the Near Eastern countries. I looked for Europe, Latin America. I couldn't find any profits, and I went to their treasurer, and I said, where are they? And the treasurer said, oh, you didn't, there's something called, at the very end of this whole column of countries, there's something called international. And I said, well, international, isn't that all these countries? He said, no, international means countries that aren't really countries. They're Libya, and they're Panama and Lagos. They're countries that don't use foreign exchange currencies of their own. They use the US dollar. And they're where we have the flags of convenience. There are shipping companies. And he said, what we do is, we don't want to have to pay Saudi Arabia or Iran or other countries much money for the income tax. So we sell the oil at a tiny, tiny little fraction, almost at the production cost, to our trading affiliates in Panama or Liberia or wherever, Liberia. And then the trading companies are in countries, Panama and Liberia don't have an income tax. So there's no income tax. They use the US dollar, so there's no foreign exchange risk. And then they sell this oil at a huge mark, such a high price to the refineries in Europe and North America, or to the final filling stations, that there are no profits to be shown in America. And so all the profits of the worldwide operations, production, refinery, distribution, are all made in these tax-exempt enclaves, Panama. When I looked at, okay, let's look at what the costs are. How much does America have to pay for the oil? Well, they said, for one thing, America only imports oil from its own companies. It won't import oil from other companies. It has to be from American-owned companies. And most of the cost of this producing Near Eastern and other oil, cost never leaves the United States. Most of it is absorbed in the profits that we make and that we declare from Liberia and et cetera, in Panama, or it's from US equipment, the oil machinery that is American made and that we export to our branches to dig the oil wells, or paid for management fees. And of course, we lend our affiliates money and our branches money, and this is all absorbed in interest that also is paid to the head office through our money lending affiliate. So actually, we only pay about 10 cents for every dollar worth of imported oil. And the 10 cents on the dollar that these countries get, they have to spend it on US arms as part of the defense contract. So America doesn't really pay a penny for the oil that it gets. It's all free. And that's why we really shouldn't have the government limit what we're doing abroad, because we're stripping their assets. We're getting rich off them. So I wrote my report. I would have thought that Arab countries and socialists would have been interested in my report, but Chase Manhattan printed it, put it on the desk of every senator and representative in the United States, went up for a vote, and the oil industry was exempted. So oil is a key to the American empire, and it's a key because it is the most exploitative resource, along with mining, pays no foreign income tax, pays very little production abroad, and all of the profits accrue to the head office supporting the dollar. Now, the year after the Iranian coup d'etat, you had the next democracy to be overthrown was in Guatemala in 1954. 10 years earlier, a revolution had overthrown the dictator and installed a democracy. And the democratic elected president, Jacobo Arbenz, urged land reform. He wanted to give the peasants land of their own. But the United Fruit Company wanted to use the land not to feed Guatemalans, but to make bananas to export to the United States and feed Americans and Europeans. And the Dulles brothers said, any country that has land reform is anti-American and is going to go communist. So you have to prevent it. So America had a coup d'etat that brought dictatorship to Guatemala, just as it brought dictatorship under Pérez Jiménez to Venezuela, and overthrew the elected Brazilian government and other government. So essentially, the American empire claiming to be the free world and democratic is a string of military dictatorships as allies. And the main, just as it opposes foreign ownership of oil, unless the country agrees to send all the profits, invest in the United States, as Saudi Arabia does, land reform is opposed, not only because the US wants the land for its own plantation agriculture, like United Fruit or other foreign landowners, but it doesn't want countries to grow their own food because a basic element of America's trade surplus, one of the few areas in surplus, is the farm sector. America's grain exports. So farm exports provide an enormous subsidy of the American empire. And it also, by making other countries dependent on American grain, you can starve them out if they do something you don't like. So in the 1950s, after Mao's revolution in China, America said, let's starve it out. Let's have a sanction. No country can export grain to China. We've got to starve them. Well, as you know, Canada broke the embargo and did export grain to China. But the United States has been able to convince most countries to rely on US grain and other essentials, so that America wants the ability to create havoc in other countries if they don't do what US officials tell them to do. And the greatest threat to US global strategy became the non-aligned movement that its leaders, 5 leaders, created in Belgrade, Yugoslavia in 1961. Each of these leaders was the first president of his country. Sukarno in Indonesia, Tito in Yugoslavia, Nasser in Egypt, and Nkrumah in Ghana, and Nehru in India. And the non-aligned meant trying to create a structure of world diplomacy and trade and finance that was independent of US control. Well, obviously, the United States fought this. It wasn't jealous of these countries. It wasn't a fit of jealousy that made it want to overthrow it. It wanted to control them. And if it couldn't control them, to destroy them. So that's why the United States sought to isolate and overthrow their leaders. And the most distressing leader to American strategists was Sukarno in Indonesia. He'd led the resistance to the Dutch Empire in 1945, and in the mid-1950s, he'd negotiated with China and also became the largest recipient of Russian foreign aid alongside Cuba. And Indonesia had a very large Chinese population that played a major role in its financial and commercial economy, as it does throughout much of Asia. So the United States organized a bloody coup. It killed up to over 500,000 Chinese. It was a racist coup. It said all Chinese are potentially communist. They all have to be killed. And literally, I'm told by the witnesses, the rivers were red with blood. There was a mass ethnic genocide, and all of the American hatred that had been towards China since the 19th century was expressed in this, and America installed a vicious military dictatorship under General Suharto, very much as it had done in Guatemala and in Iran under Iran, and as it did in Chile when America wanted to overthrow the sort of wimpy socialist president there. President Henry Kissinger quipped, "I don't see why we need to stand by and watch a country go communist due to the irresponsibility of the people." The issue is much too important for the Chilean voters to be left to decide for themselves. Well, that's what America means. America created democracy there by not letting the Chileans decide for themselves, but by putting in General Pinochet and start to install free market principles and organize Operation Condor to assassinate about a reported 60,000 labor leaders, progressive academics, land reformers, and liberation theology Christians throughout Latin America. There was a huge decade-long assassination program from Chile to Argentina to Brazil to Paraguay, all over Latin America. And all of that was to prevent other countries from going communist. And the upshot was a legacy that such as followed. Hillary Clinton overthrew Honduras's president Manuel Zelaya in 2009 when he sought to do something like what Guatemala had tried to do earlier. He tried to promote a modest land reform, and Clinton said any attempt at land reform is communism, it's socialism. Essentially, the American is describing prosperity for any other country as communist and socialist. Well, what better slogan can you have for communism or socialism than what America accused it of being? And of course, the great victory everything changed pretty much. The character of the Cold War changed in 1991 when it was capped by convincing the USSR to follow neoliberal principles that the World Bank and IMF planners explained to it in a meeting in 1990 in Houston, Texas. They explained to Russian leaders how they could have shock therapy. It would wipe out the population. It would leave Russia with no money at all. And then you give this population that's had its savings wiped out by hyperinflation, you give it vouchers and companies. It'll all be sold to a few oligarchs, and then they can buy the companies give the companies to themselves, and the former managers of the companies in Russia can, and its satellites, the Baltics, can simply register the companies in their own name, and then they can sell it, part of their holdings, to Americans and Europeans to cash out and get their money abroad. And the looting of Russia was so great that Russia became the world's leading stock market in 1994, 95, 96. And it became a free-for-all of saying, well, the Russians aren't going to get a penny from their wealth. We're going to get it all from the Americans will buy out Russian oil companies, Russians minerals, nickel, Norilsk nickel, the public utilities, and essentially we can get money by, without conquering them militarily, we'll conquer them intellectually. We will convince them that this is the way to get rich. And of course, it was the way to get rich for kleptocrats. It was a way for the 1% or the 0.1% in Russia, the 7 bankers, they were called, to become billionaires and create a mass of billionaires. And the Americans said, well, that's getting rich. And you're getting rich because you're selling your stocks to the Americans for US dollars, and are using these dollars and sterling to buy big real estate in London, real estate in the United States. You're getting rich by moving your money out of Russia, leaving it sort of an empty shell. So for the American investors, the ruin of Russia was a financial success story. And it was followed by dismantling the industry and the self-reliance of the former Soviet republics. And as President George W. Bush, the younger Bush, declared in his State of the Union message in 2002, he set the stage for the invasion of Iraq in that speech. He said, quote, "By the grace of God, America won the Cold War. A world once divided into 2 armed camps now recognizes one side and as preeminent power, the United States of America." So the war being waged was being fought over whether the world economy was going to be one of neoliberal finance capitalism and rent extraction, or industrial capitalism evolving into socialism under democratically elected leaders. And as Rosa Luxemburg put this matter a century ago, what's at issue is whether the world is going to have socialism or barbarism. And this is not a clash of civilizations. It's a crisis over what kind of civilization the world is going to have. And that is how you should view the American attempt to create its empire. To the United States, essentially, power and empire means the privilege of intervening in the policies of other nations to prevent them from deviating from any financial or trade or military dependency on the United States. And the result is a kind of globalization that's antithetical to national moves to protect industrial and agricultural self-sufficiency. It's necessary for other countries not to be self-sufficient, but to rely on the US for their military arms, for their military strategy and direction, for their food supply, for their internet technology, and for everything else that countries basically need as an essential. This is like military warfare in the sense that it aims to capture the commanding heights of foreign economies, starting with communications, transportation, power utilities, most of all the finance and banking systems, the information technology of monopolies. But what makes this Cold War diplomacy different is that the United States really is not agreement capable. An empire, it's supposed to have some kind of ruling law. At least the Romans said we brought law. Unfortunately, the law was we get to take everything from you and kill everyone, all of your leaders that we don't like. But at least there was a law. But the United States says we're the exceptional economy, meaning we are not obliged to live up to any international contract or agreement that we sign. That's why the United States insisted on having veto power in the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank when it joined. It's why it insisted on having veto power in the UN Security Council when it joined. It says no other country can tell us what to do, but we can tell other countries what to do, and we can destroy them if they don't follow what we tell them to do. So essentially, this inability, refusal to live up to contracts goes from the very beginning of the American Republic in its land treaties with the Native American tribes. It violated them all. Just ignore it, just a sheet of paper, because there's no enforcement process. To President Trump's withdrawal from the Iran agreement, from the Paris Climate Accord, and from the ballistic missile agreements with Russia, and from the arms parity policy that dates all the way back to Eisenhower's administration in the 1950s, trying to prevent nuclear war. Not to mention the US promises that America made to Russia, that if it let Germany reunify in 1990, NATO would never move a single inch or foot eastward. Well, of course, it just broke all that. And the US said, well, what are you going to do about it? What's the if there's no penalty and no means of enforcing an international law means nothing. That the United States just again recently announced we're not going to join the Hague Tribunal or international law, because if we did, you'd accuse our leaders of war crimes and try to hang us like we hung the German Nazis. So of course we're not going to obey international law, because we are the law. The law is whatever we do. When Americans do it, it's not criminal. Well, that's what President Nixon said. When the president does it, it's not breaking the law. Essentially, that's America's philosophy internationally. So the US officials now defend the rights to use nuclear weapons and have them pretty widely distributed. And the incoming Biden administration here has hinted that it plans to appoint a super hawk, Michelle Flournoy, as Secretary of Defense. She was already Assistant Secretary of Defense in the Clinton administration. And in that role, she was the principal author of a report in May 1997, the Quadrennial Defense Review. And that review defined US vital interests to include, quote, preventing the emergence of a hostile regional coalition anywhere, and quote, ensuring uninhibited access to foreign key markets, energy supplies, and strategic resources. In other words, any attempt by foreign countries to keep their oil, their land, their mineral resources, their agricultural land in their own hands makes them an enemy, and we intend to fight them militarily, and we reserve the rights to use atomic weapons where necessary. In other words, wherever we want to, because we feel threatened if they will become independents. Foreign independence, foreign democracy is defined as an economic and hence existential threat to the United States. So announcing that the United States no longer felt obliged to, by the UN Charter that prohibited the use of military force, Flournoy wrote, when the interests at stake are vital, we should do whatever it takes to defend them, including, when necessary, the unilateral use of military power. Now, by framing the unilateral use of military force all over the world as defending vital interests, the Pentagon asserted the right to commit what international law defines as the supreme international crime. That was what the judges at Nuremberg said. But the United States now defends its ability to do what the German generals were hung in Nuremberg for doing. So the result is a fight really between opposing political systems. It's not jealousy within a common economic system of competition. It's not rivalry. When the United States tries to block China's Huawei or TikTok from North American and European markets, it's not rivalry at all. It's a life or death attempt to prevent rivalry from other countries that that might seek financial and military independence. And so the United States leaves its allies with little choice but to try to break away from the exploitative nature. What is Europe going to do? America tells Europe, don't use Huawei or TikTok, don't use Chinese technology, use American technology. Don't buy inexpensive Russian natural gas. You've got to stop the Nord Stream pipeline and buy expensive liquefied natural gas from the Americans, and you have to spend billions of dollars building ports that are specially fitted for container ships taking American gas, so you'll become dependent on American gas, not on Russian gas. And the problem with Chinese technology, America made very clear. China has not built American spy systems into its technology. This October, the Trump administration said China does not permit a backdoor so that the government can read what goes on in Huawei and TikTok things. If we can't read what users of these systems say all over the world, we feel insecure, and we can't permit that. You Europeans and other countries have to buy Facebook and other Google and other American systems where we have a black door and we can read everything that you say through the National Security Council computers, because otherwise we feel insecure. So this is, again, it's a totalitarian attitude. Russia's Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, said on October 13th, he said, the most distinctive feature of our time is this. Everyone understands that a redistribution of power is taking place. And this is exactly what our Western colleagues are fighting so adamantly, clinging to their centuries of dominance to prevent. And he went on to say a number of things that are worth repeating because they show at least how explicit Russia is in realizing the gauntlet that is being thrown down by the Americans. He said, the substance of the modern epoch is an objective process of formation of a more democratic, multipolar international order. It is a difficult and long process. It will probably take an entire epoch. And he added, the European Union has just tried to add more sanctions against Russia, claiming that Navalny, when he got sick, it was all Russia's fault. And because that, somehow Europe should break relations with Russia. So Lavrov said, if the EU is arrogant enough to declare with this sense of unconditional superiority, that Russia must understand there will be no business as usual, well, Russia wants to understand whether there could be any business at all with the European Union under these conditions. Those people who are responsible for foreign policy in the West do not understand the need for mutually respectful communication. So we should probably stop communicating with them for a while. Well, that is the only way to have an alternative to the American Cold War empire. It is necessary to withdraw from it. There's no way that you can outcompete with the Americans because they won't permit competition. They insist if you do have a competitive sector, whether it's producing a raw material or whether it's a technology sector, the Americans insist in owning it and remitting the profits to their own economy. So the idea is whether you're going to have a world where the US siphons off the wealth financially, not by military occupation, but financially, or you get financial independence to prevent this. And the American philosophy is privatization of natural resources and monopolies. To use privatization as a siphon to extract the income of labor and industry in your countries. Well, the reason that the United States in the 19th century, Soviet Russia, China have public utilities and public investment is you want to keep the cost of living low. You want to provide essentials at various subsidized costs or freely. You don't want your cost of living to go way up by turning your health system, your schooling system, your roads over to private monopolies to turn into toll roads, $50,000 a year education, and others. The whole idea of a successful industrial economy is you need public ownership and public investment in basic infrastructure, and the United States wants to privatize all of this. So ultimately, the attempt to financialize and privatize your infrastructure will leave you end up looking like England looked after Margaret Thatcher and Tony Blair. It's the road to an economic dark age and depopulation. You look like Greece or you look like Argentina. Now, under the American sponsored dollar diplomacy, you have the disparities in wealth are going to widen, not only among nations, so that the wealthy nations get much richer than the third world. And right now, third world raw materials exporters are broke because of the coronavirus interruption of activity. So they're unable to pay the foreign debts. And the United States and European foreign investors are saying, this is great. The virus is now enabling us to come in to bankrupt Latin America, Africa, and the Near East. And now we can grab all of we can tell their governments, well, we'll give you money to survive in medicine, but you have to sell off your public utilities and land and anything that you still have in the public domain, you have to sell off to us. So the United States is now trying to treat Latin America, Africa, and the Near East like it treated Russia after 1991. That's the ideal. That's a success story, and it's a kind of financialized dollar diplomacy, and it's applied at home as well as internationally. The domestic American population economy is polarizing. The population is falling deeper and deeper in debt. Homelessness is rising. Unemployment is rising. And the cost of living is rising so much through a privatized healthcare system and pension fund system and privatized utilities that American labor cannot compete with other countries. There's no jealousy of competition. There's no competition at all, given the American high cost of financialized rent-seeking cost of living. Well, the problem is that with having a wealthy nation is that wealth is addictive and it produces greed. And greed is rapacious. It wants to have all of the money in the world for itself. Henry Kissinger said that power is the ultimate aphrodisiac, but if power is achieved through money, then the aphrodisiac payoff is impoverishing the rest of the world by siphoning off all the money in the economy up to the upper 1%. And that's exactly what's happened in the United States since the Obama depressions of 2009 that we're still in. How do you avoid this? To achieve a political and economic independence, and you decouple from dollar diplomacy, that requires a critical mass with enough countries in it so that they can together be self-sufficient in their own essentials. This didn't exist after World War II, when Europe and the rest of the world was devastated. It didn't exist even with the non-aligned group because the 5 countries weren't sufficient to become a bloc of their own. What's needed now is to not only to be financially independent, you need your own monetary system to create your own money, so that and as a public utility, so if debts rise, the government is a creditor, the government can write down the debt, as China does. You also need your own bank clearing system. There's a technology for transferring funds over the telephone or through banks, and America had worked through Luxembourg, sort of like the island of Delos or the sacred island of Delphi, a site of Delphi. Luxembourg was supposed to be independent, and that had the SWIFT bank clearing system, but it really is part of the US Pentagon. It's a military system where the US can threaten to create financial havoc in Russia or other countries using it if all of a sudden you don't let any of their bank transfers take place. So other countries need to break free of the American and the European infrastructure, realizing that European is a satellite of the United States. It's the Europe has become a dead zone economically. It's being impoverished because its governments are not able to create their own money to run their own budget deficits beyond 3% of GDP. So its governments are not able to pull their economies out of depression. They're not able to produce enough euros as public debt to become a rival vehicle for other countries to hold their central bank reserves. It can't rival the dollar. And the United States created Europe as a non-rival, as a satellite, as a dependent area. So the most recent grouping after the non-aligned group has been the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And the group, the BRICS, an alliance of Russia, China, India, South Africa, and Brazil, with Iran as an associate. The ideal is to begin by being independent economically within yourself, so you don't need the US market or US suppliers. You can produce your own basic needs and let the United States be isolated. What's up for grabs is Europe. How long will European populations permit the utterly corrupt Social Democratic Party or the corrupt Labour Party or the corrupt Christian Democrats or the corrupt other parties of Europe to be arms of the United States State Department? How long will Europe let European politics be like Australian politics, simply doing whatever they're told by the US or Britain acting on behalf of the United States? If the rest of the world, the rest of Asia, Vietnam, other countries, China, can become wealthier and wealthier with their own resources, and together these countries have enough of their own resources to be independent, then you let the other world, as the United States has warmed, the American affluence means the flowing in from abroad. American affluence will dry up because without the empire, America won't be able to drain other countries financially. Without the dollar area, without dependence on the US dollar, on US banks, on US bondholders as creditors, the United States will not be able to essentially get the free lunch that it's been able to get really ever since World War II, as we'll be discussing in the next lecture. So that what's required is sort of not only an international, to do that, is not only an international economic capability, but you need an ideology of international law and a foreign policy whose guiding principles are predicated uh, on blocking rent extraction through monopoly privileges and through realizing that public infrastructure is uh, a source of production. Every country needs to be self-sufficient in food. Every country needs to be self-sufficient with its own financial and banking system. It needs to be self-sufficient in essentials or to have real allies that are not mutually exploitative, but realize if we don't support each other, we're going to be divided and conquered by the United States. So I think that a guiding legal principle to break out and to draw the third world, Africa and Latin America, into this new alternative to dollar diplomacy is that legal principle should be written into international law that no country should be obliged to pay foreign debt by forfeiting its own natural resources or monopolies or capital investment, and should not be required to cut back living standards of labor in order to pay its foreign debt. That the right of any independent nation is economic independence, not to let itself be impoverished by foreign creditors. In other words, countries that owe dollar debt would simply negate it as essentially odious foreign debt. This foreign debt was taken on under military and political force and by a deliberate US warping of their development to push their balance of payments into deficit, requiring debt to American bondholders and the International Monetary Fund and bondholders among the client oligarchies of these countries. All these debts should be wiped out in order to wipe out the savings of the oligarchy faction, because what's at stake is a fight between democracy or socialism and oligarchy and militarized oligarchy. So throughout history, from classical Greece and Rome down to modern debtor countries, a common denominator of all democracy for 2,500 years has been debt cancellation and the ending of absentee land ownership. Democracies in Greece and Rome and subsequent Western countries did not achieve this. There was always pressure for it. There was revolutions for it. There were uprisings from it century after century, but democracy was never able to do it. The only place that was able to achieve this kind of debt cancellation and independence was through the Near Eastern rulers, from Hammurabi's Babylonia to the Neo-Assyrian and Babylonian and Persian empires in the first millennium BC. And rulers held the loyalty and support of their local populations by periodically proclaiming clean slates that annulled debts and liberated indebted bondservants and restored self-support land to debtors who'd forfeited to foreclosing creditors. This didn't occur in the West. The West, whether it's democracy or oligarchy, never had that kind of debt cancellation. Western law, ever since Rome, has been built in to European and American law that creditors have rights that are overshadow the rights of actual owners who are indebted and the population as a whole. The finance basically becomes the center of economic planning and of resource allocation by letting creditors be in charge of resource allocation and by having creditor-controlled governments that block any kind of public or democratic or socialist control over how the economic surplus is invested. So as a transition to the next lecture, the United States finances its military spending abroad and related diplomacy by demanding that foreign countries guarantee a stipulated part of their grain markets, their other markets, to US suppliers, and that they rely on US banks and US creditors for the money that they need to grow. instead of being in charge of their own markets and their own financing. Finance capitalism's mode of economic control is affected through monopoly privilege of creating money and credit domestically and abroad by US banks that own foreign banks. No country should let foreigners own and control the banking system because banking credit is simply created electronically, and it extracts interest, and it sends the interest abroad, and it uses the interest proceeds to lend more and more against assets and to indebt the economy more and more. The ideal is, in order to be economically independent, you have to prevent the financial dynamic from growing and taking you over, as we'll be discussing in the fifth lecture of the series. The financial privilege that America has, the dollar privilege, is the capstone of US international strategy. And it's the dollar's role not only as a dominant means of payments, but to balance the payments deficits without limit by printing as many dollars as it wants to finance the costs of its military empire and political bribery and meddling and interference in foreign politics. So the financial privilege essentially is the capstone of preserving the dollar's dominant role, and in order to have an independent alternative, other countries need the money creation privilege to take it back into the public domain as a public infrastructure utility controlled to allocate its own income in a way that will help it grow to benefit its own population, not to benefit foreign investors from the United States or its satellites.